It was a while ago that I wrote about my experiences with Mr. Pontiac and that game show, but it took a long time to work up the courage to finally publish it on Reddit. I still half wonder if I didn't just imagine the whole thing. I broke up with Jessie a few months after the incident in the basement, but Scott and me are still friends all these years later. Scott won't ever mention that night, and whenever I ask him about it, he gets this weird look in his eyes and quickly changes the subject. He's got kids now. I've been married, divorced, married again, divorced again. I can't seem to find peace of mind. Can't seem to find any kind of real closure. Maybe Mr. Pontiac got a little bit of my soul after all. I was amazed by the response when I finally published my experiences on Reddit. It felt good to have so many people comment and offer me encouragement, and it was a relief that people weren't calling me crazy. But before I lay this whole thing to rest, I figured I'd tell you about an email a girl sent me a couple of hours ago. It sent a chill up my spine when I saw it, because now I know I'm not crazy. That there's someone out there who had an experience similar to mine. It was like a weight lifting off my shoulders. So this is the message in full. Hi Nick, my name is Connie V, and I'm from Salem, Massachusetts. And I just wanted to say I really connected with the story. I got addicted to the game show from hell. I know a lot of people will probably think it's just a piece of fiction, that you made the whole thing up. But I know it's all true, because of what happened to me a few years ago.
I was in the last year of high school at the time, and I'd lost my dad about 3 years earlier. He died in a fishing accident when his boat capsized about a mile off the Misery Islands, and it hit me and my mum pretty hard. We were always a close family, but after he died, my mum started working extra shifts at the hospital. She's a nurse, and I threw myself into my studies. My best friend Sadie was a year older than me. She was obsessed with the occult. She always dressed in black and her skin was really pale, like ghost pale. She looked like your typical goth chick. She was really pretty, but really morbid looking at the same time. And she'd go on all the time about killing herself. She wasn't depressed or anything. She just had this really unhealthy fascination with death. Anyway, Sadie was always trying to seduce me into the occult. I guess I was vulnerable at the time. I just wanted my dad back and she was exploiting my loss. So under pressure I tried out the Ouija board a couple of times, but nothing much happened. And then she introduced me to black mirror scrying, which involves sitting still for long periods of time and staring into a black mirrored surface. Only we didn't use an actual mirror. We used the screen of her TV. Sadie said that all the new flat-screen TVs served as black mirrors, that they were really doorways to the other side, and that you could conjure all kinds of things through them if you knew how. I didn't believe her in the beginning, but staring into that black screen for an hour at a time, I began to see things, maybe just eye strain, but weird enough to scare the hell out of me, and so I stopped going around to Sadie's house after that. I stayed away from her for a long time, and even when I saw her at school, I made a point of pretending I didn't see her. But one night, Sadie called me up and begged me to come over to her place. Mom was working late as usual, and there was a note of desperation in Sadie's voice that I never heard before, so I said, sure, I'll be right over. The front door to her house was ajar when I got there, so I went right up to her room. Sadie was sitting on her bed staring into the flat-screen TV that hung on the wall opposite her. She had this look of fixed concentration on her face, and when I asked her what was going on, she held a finger to her lips and said, shh, do you see it? The TV was blank. See what? I asked. The game show, she said. I frowned and shook my head. There was a glassy look in Sadie's eyes that I didn't like. It was as though she was in some kind of trance. Keep looking, she encouraged me. I stared at the screen. I stared for a long time until I began to imagine I saw something lurking deep down beneath the darkness, and the sound of a faraway studio audience, laughing and cheering. Tearing my eyes away from the screen, I turned to Sadie and said, you've got to quit messing around with this shit. I deliberately positioned myself between her and the TV set, but Sadie leaned sideways so she could continue staring at the screen. It was like trying to get between an addict and their fix. That was the last straw. I'm going, I told her. You'll have to figure this out for yourself, Sadie. He wants me to come on over, Sadie said without looking away from the screen. Who wants you to come on over? Mr. P. He says the show's always looking for new contestants. I left her there, staring into the screen and giggling at something only she could see. That was the last time I ever saw her. 2 days later, I heard Sadie had cut her throat, right there in her bedroom. I think I'd been half expecting something like that to happen, but it still came as one hell of a punch in the gut. I remember when I got the news, I couldn't breathe. It was like all the air had been sucked out of my lungs. I sat in the backyard and my hands shook as I stared down at them. My heart ached so bad. I'd let Sadie down. I should never have left her like that. I wear a necklace with a little gold cross that my dad had given me shortly before he died. I was holding on to that cross now, passing it between my fingers. It was a habit of mine. Something I did whenever I was stressed. It reminded me of Dad. Sadie's death had brought up all that grief I thought I'd dealt with. I missed Dad. I missed Sadie. I felt like everyone I cared about was slipping away. After a while, I began to cry. It was a few days after Sadie's funeral. My nights had been growing increasingly restless, my dreams filled with the most bizarre imagery, until one morning I woke up in a state of confusion. I couldn't figure out why it was so light in my bedroom. I thought it must have been close to dawn, but a quick glance at my clock showed me it was only 3 a.m. That's when I realised the light was coming from the TV. Slowly I sat up. The TV was attached to a small wall-mounted unit opposite my bed. There was some kind of game show playing. I frowned as I looked around for the remote control. It was lying on the floor about a foot from my bed, and I failed to see how the TV could have accidentally turned itself on. I knew it was that show, the one Sadie had been talking about the last time I saw her. I don't know how to describe it, but it's like you said, Nick. It had this 80s vibe about it, maybe the clothes, maybe the hairstyles, but definitely mid-80s. The video quality was actually quite good, and the colours really bright, like the inside of a fast food restaurant or a child's play school. There was that guy, Mr. Pontiac. He was the host. He had this freakish chin, just the way you described it, and I remember he was huge. Not fat huge, but just really, really big, and he was wearing this tight tweed suit with a ridiculous small bow tie. In the version of the game I watched, Mr. Pontiac had 2 female assistants with him. They were very, very tall and very lanky women with pale, almost bloodless skin, and they smiled in a really creepy way, all teeth, with no genuine warmth. But it was only in close-up that I noticed their eyes blinked sideways, like the eyes of reptiles. Mr. Pontiac and his assistants stood opposite 4 contestants who were all competing to answer as many questions as they could within a fixed period of time. But it wasn't the nature of the game that caught my attention. It was the fact that the contestants all looked so freakish. There was a guy with shards of mirror covering his eyes, his teeth all painted black, or else they'd rotted down to stumps. The mirrors must have been cutting into the guy's flesh because he was bleeding heavily from the eyes, a fact that didn't seem to bother anyone else. Beside him sat a woman with pale blue skin. If rigor mortis had a colour, it would have been that woman's skin. It was cold and lifeless looking. She had huge heroin bruised eyes and flesh tunnels puncturing her cheeks so you could see her teeth right through the holes. The guy next to her had patches of skin cut away from his face in neat squares and triangles and circles like a kid's education toy. You know, the kind you have to fit the right shaped block into the right shaped hole. But it was a 4th contestant that literally sent shivers of horror rippling across my scalp. It was a pale girl, dressed all in black with a gaping wound in her throat that resembled a second mouth. I recognised her almost instantly. It was Sadie. I remember letting out a long moan of distress, my legs frantically kicking at the bedclothes as though I was trying to get up out of bed, but I couldn't. My limbs were awkward, flopping about as though all the nerves had been rewired, knocking a glass of water off the side table, and I heard it smash apart on the ground. I was terrified. I remember being so scared I couldn't even function properly. Mr. Pontiac was asking all these questions that made no sense, and the contestants would hit these buzzers just as fast as he asked them.
For 3 points, what is a jumbo jet? To fly, Mr. P,
said the man with mirror eyes.
For 2 points, why is a fly? To buzz, Mr. P,
said the man with cutout shapes in his face.
Bonus points, why is a buzz? To say hello,
said the girl with flesh tunnels in her cheeks, her teeth making a grotesque clackety-clack sound.
Ooh, wrong answer, my girl.
Mr. Pontiac roared.
The right answer should be to catch the 4:35 to Pembroke.
The studio audience howled with laughter as Mr. Pontiac gave this crazy little shuffle that looked a lot like a rain dance. His shoulders stooped and his knuckles trailing the ground.
Choose a door,
He cried.
choose a challenge. Shoo-shoo, off you go, my darling. It's not exactly rocket science.
His assistants yanked on thick braided cords that hung down from the studio ceiling, whisking a pair of enormous curtains aside to reveal a near-endless series of doors. Each door was a different colour: green, blue, yellow, red, mauve, indigo. Door after door, marching off into the distance. The girl with the flesh tunnels ran along the line of doors, becoming increasingly hysterical as Mr. Pontiac conducted a 10-second countdown.
6, 5, 4, 3.
With 3 seconds to spare, the girl chose a pink door, and the audience rose to its feet and roared approval as she pulled the door open and stepped inside. On the other side of the door, the girl was confronted by a glass-enclosed hall with a floor made up of large checkered tiles. She looked terrified as she set out across the hall, like she was trying to avoid waking something up. And I noticed large conical objects hanging above her that resembled enormous beehives. I figured the girl was trying not to rouse them. Despite her best efforts, she wound up stepping on the wrong tile, and a beehive came crashing down, splitting apart as it hit the ground and releasing a black cloud of furious bees. The girl gave a shriek of fear and began to run. Another beehive fell, and another, both of them exploding upon impact, and a second and a third cloud of bees erupted outwards.
Suffering is good for the soul.
Mr. Pontiac yelled with glee. The girl didn't stand a chance, and before she'd even reached the halfway point, she was covered in a million stinging, stabbing bees, and down she went, howling and convulsing as her body was literally shrouded in a mass of black, seething insects. After a while, she stopped moving, and I realised I was gasping for breath, my heart pounding with fear. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen. The audience were insane with bloodlust on their feet and screaming. And as the camera panned across them, I could see individual faces melting and twisting like tile, and for a moment they all resembled a vast gallery of demons. Mr. Pontiac was meanwhile yelling for a replacement contestant to be brought up, and instantly a small group of dwarfs appeared from backstage, carrying a fire hose between them and using a powerful jet of water to drive a cowering, gasping prisoner before them.
He killed himself when he found his wife in bed with his best friend.
Mr. Pontiac announced in a thunderous voice.
He left behind 3 children and a sizable mortgage. A naughty, naughty boy. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Stuart H. Murdoch, formerly of Peoria, Illinois.
The audience's applause was rapturous as the dwarfs forced Stuart to join the other contestants.
I'm not supposed to be here.
He sobbed.
I killed myself. I swear to God it was an accident. That's what they all say.
Mr. Pontiac mocked.
But you don't wind up on game for suicides by accident, Stuart, my boy. Everybody's here by choice.
As I stared at the screen, Sadie turned to stare at me, and I clearly saw her mouth the words, "Help me." I don't know how long I watched that game. It could have been a matter of hours, it could have been days, it just never ended. It never stopped for commercials, and slowly but surely it crept under my skin. I couldn't help it. I was screaming at the screen, or at least I imagine I was. I was jeering and cheering with the audience, and I even found myself answering Mr. Pontiac's meaningless questions.
Why is the door?
"To lock, Mr. P!" I yelled a second before the contestants hit their buzzers.
Why is a lock?
"To key, Mr. P!" I shrieked. Jesus Christ, I could play this game in my sleep.
Why is the key?
"To open the gates to hell, Mr. P!" I howled. But Sadie got the answer wrong. Sadie was stupid. Sadie deserved what was coming. I didn't even flinch when those misshapen little dwarfs appeared behind the green door that Sadie chose. They were all wearing identical Mr. P masks. They looked like little miniature versions of the host, and all of them wielding chainsaws that growled and snarled as the dwarfs chased poor Sadie up and down a series of moving escalators. I couldn't stop laughing. I was laughing so hard, I think I peed myself. Sadie didn't do too badly. She managed to get hold of a crowbar and smashed one of the dwarfs across the head, instantly caving his skull in. And she kicked another one back down the escalator, causing him to crash headlong into the dwarfs crowding up from below. Chainsaws bit into flesh as the dwarfs were sent tumbling head over heels down the escalator, limbs torn off and blood spraying in every direction. But in the end, there were too many dwarfs coming at Sadie from too many directions, and I clapped my hands with glee as they finally cornered her and hacked her to pieces, and all the while she was screaming at me to help her. But I felt no pity for her, because I knew no one came to the game by accident. Everyone was there by choice. The games were delightfully perverse. There was one game in particular. A contestant raced through a garden of razor-blade flowers and bushes made of barbed wire that slowly sliced into bits, until a steel Venus flytrap finally snapped its head off and sent it tumbling into the audience. That was as funny as fuck. As soon as a contestant was dispatched, another one was hosed out of a filthy holding pen and forced to take their place, and I realised there were two Mr. Pontiacs. The studio lighting changing whenever the second Mr. Pontiac came on set. The colours would become muted and everything would get darker, grainier, and the audience would become hushed, almost frightened. The second Mr. Pontiac only turned up when a contestant was killed. He seemed to feed on their suffering. He was always angry, and he screamed at the studio technicians and cussed at the dwarfs, and called the contestants every vile name under the sun. I was a little scared every time he made an appearance. Sadie kept coming back. Every 5th or 6th round, she'd turn up to play the game all over again, like she'd never died. I don't think she can really die because she's already dead. I don't think any of the contestants can really die. This is their eternity. This is the game they'll play till the end of time. And for some reason I want to join them. I want to play this game as well. I was frightened in the beginning, but now I realise the game is everything. The game is the only thing. Mr. Pontiac seemed to notice me at last.
Oh, hey!
He called out from the TV.
What are you doing on the other side of that screen, sister? You want to be over here on this side where all the action is, where all your friends are.
Half dazed, half flattered, I asked, "Are you talking to me?"
Why, I sure am, little sister. Come join us for a chance to win big, big, big!
The audience gave a thunderous ovation, and I realised they were all clapping for me, and I felt so special, like a real bona fide celebrity.
Your father is here!
Mr. Pontiac yelled over the sound of the audience. The camera swung around and focused on a man standing up in the audience and waving at the screen.
Come on over, Connie!
The man shouted.
Mr. P throws one hell of a party.
My heart gave a painful jolt of recognition. "Daddy?"
It's okay, baby.
He hollered.
Quick slice is the best advice. Bleeding out removes the doubt.
He waved at me.
And then you and me and eternity makes 3. Ooh, clever man.
Mr. Pontiac crooned.
What a way with words your dad has. Come on, Connie, my girl. Try a little dose of suicide. You know what they say, you haven't lived until you've died. Man up, Connie.
The audience chanted.
Man up, Connie.
I looked down at my hands and realised I was holding a shard of glass from the shattered tumbler. It was slicing into the palm of my hand, and my blood was dripping onto the sheets.
Man up, Connie. Man up, Connie. Man up, Connie.
I don't understand. Dad didn't kill himself. Why is he on a game for suicides? Why is he in the audience? My dad was a good man. He doesn't deserve to be on that game.
Don't think about it.
Mr. Pontiac was yelling at me.
Just do it, my girl. Quick and slick.
I'm so tempted. So close, holding that shard tight in my hand. One quick slice across my throat, and then I'd be on that show, on the other side of the screen, and I wasn't going to be a loser like all the other contestants. I knew all the answers. Mr. Pontiac would be so pleased with me because I knew all the answers. But why was Dad on that show? He didn't kill himself. He loved us too much to kill himself. Slowly I dropped the shard of glass, and reaching up I took hold of the cross I always wore around my neck.
What are you doing, Connie?
Mr. Pontiac yelled, and I realised the audience had started to jeer at me.
Come on, we're all waiting for you.
I shook my head. "I'm not coming," I said. There was a deathly silence following this announcement. I glanced up. Mr. Pontiac was staring at me out of the screen. Not the happy Mr. Pontiac, the other one, the angry one, who only turned up when people got hurt. He was sneering at me, and his teeth were dirty and yellow, and I remember his eyes were coal black.
You haven't beaten me.
He hissed.
I'll have your soul, you little sow. And then I swear to the Dark Lord of Suffering, I'll make you scream for an eternity.
And then the screen went black. Well, Nick, that's it. That's the way it happened. I don't have a TV anymore. I refuse to be in the same room as the TV. And I guess I'd almost forgotten about that incident until I read your story. You could publish my story if you want. Maybe it will help people believe you. I hope it does. And I hope that all those people trapped on that show someday find peace. I don't care what they did when they were alive. No one deserves to suffer like that. Thanks for listening.